I sat in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at my phone screen while my daughter's voice cracked through the international connection from somewhere in Myanmar. "Mom, they left me here," she whispered, and I could hear the fear she was trying to hide behind those 4 words. My ex-husband's family had taken her on what they called a cultural heritage trip to visit distant relatives, but now she was calling me from a monastery where strangers had given her shelter, telling me that her aunt and uncle had simply vanished with her passport, her money, and her return ticket. The kitchen tiles felt ice cold under my bare feet as I gripped the phone tighter, realizing that the people I'd trusted with my child's safety had abandoned her in a country the State Department had marked as "do not travel" just 3 months earlier. My hands started shaking as she told me she'd been waiting for 2 days for them to come back, sleeping on a thin mat in a room with 5 other women, too scared to leave the monastery grounds because she didn't speak the language and had no identification. That's when something shifted inside me, not panic, not desperation, but a cold, calculating fury that would drive every decision I made for the next 18 months. My name is Thessaly, and before this nightmare began, I ran the emergency response unit at Denver General Hospital. Most people saw me as the woman who could handle anything, the one who stayed calm when trauma victims came through those doors covered in blood, the one who made split-second decisions that saved lives. At home, I kept that same energy. My small apartment near the hospital was organized like a command center, emergency contacts pinned to the refrigerator, first aid supplies in every room, travel documents filed in waterproof folders. I'd been a single mother for 6 years, ever since my divorce from Marcus, and I'd built our life around preparation and independence. Every morning at 5:30, I'd sit at my kitchen table with black coffee and review the day's patient load while Raina got ready for school. She was 18 now, technically an adult, but still my responsibility in every way that mattered. The walls of our kitchen were covered with her acceptance letters from 3 different colleges, all offering substantial scholarships for pre-med programs. She wanted to follow in my footsteps, and I couldn't have been prouder. But there was something else about me that most people didn't know. Before nursing school, before the divorce, before Denver, I'd worked for 5 years as a paralegal specializing in international family law. I understood custody disputes, visa complications, and legal jurisdictions in ways that had nothing to do with emergency medicine. That knowledge had been dormant for over a decade, filed away like old textbooks, but it was still there, waiting. If this story hits home, make sure you're subscribed. We tell these for a reason. Marcus had remarried within a year of our divorce, choosing Delphine, whose family had money and connections that stretched back to Myanmar. They lived in a sprawling house in Cherry Hills Village, complete with a meditation garden and imported furniture that cost more than I made in 3 months. When Raina turned 16, they started talking about heritage, about connecting her to her father's roots, about experiences that would broaden her worldview. I should have seen the signs earlier. During family court hearings, Marcus's sister Theta would sit in the back row, whispering to their mother in rapid Burmese, shooting looks at me like I was some kind of obstacle to their family's grand plans. When they offered to take Raina on a summer trip to Southeast Asia, they presented it as educational, transformative. They had contacts there, they said. Distant relatives who owned businesses, who could show her the real culture, not the tourist version. The second warning came 6 months before the trip, during one of Raina's weekend visits to their house. She came home confused, telling me that Aunt Theta had been asking strange questions about my work schedule, about whether I had savings, about how often I traveled. When I called Marcus to ask about it, he brushed me off, saying his sister was just curious about how we were managing financially. But there was something in his voice, a smugness that made my stomach turn. Then came the paperwork. They needed Raina's passport for the visa applications, they said. They needed medical records, emergency contact information, detailed itineraries. Everything had to be perfect, they explained, because Myanmar's government was strict about documentation. I handed over every document they requested, trusting that these people, who shared my daughter's blood, would protect her the way I would. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in July. Reina's voice was barely above a whisper, crackling through a connection that sounded like it was bouncing off satellites halfway around the world. She told me she was hiding in the bathroom of a monastery in Mandalay, using a phone that belonged to one of the nuns. Uncle Kyo and Aunt Theta had left 3 days earlier, she said, claiming they needed to handle some business in Yangon and would be back to collect her. But they never came back. The monks had been kind, she said, giving her food and a place to sleep, but they were asking questions she couldn't answer. Where was her family? When would someone come for her? Why didn't she have any identification? She'd searched through her belongings and realized that not only had they taken her passport, but they'd also removed her emergency cash, her credit cards, even the phone number I'd written on a piece of paper and hidden in her backpack. As she spoke, I could hear the fear creeping into her voice. She was trying to be brave, trying to sound like she had things under control, but I knew my daughter. I could hear the way her breath caught when she mentioned sleeping on the floor. I could hear the exhaustion in her pauses, the way she kept asking if I was still there, as if the connection might fail and leave her completely alone. That's when the pieces clicked together in my mind. This wasn't carelessness or poor planning. This was intentional. They had systematically removed every tool she might use to get help or get home. They had left her defenseless in a country where she didn't speak the language, in a region where American citizens were actively discouraged from traveling. And they had done it knowing that I was thousands of miles away, with no resources to reach her quickly. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. These people had sat at custody hearings, had smiled at me during school events, had promised to treat Reina like their own family. And then they had abandoned her like she was nothing. After I hung up, I sat in my dark kitchen for nearly an hour, staring at the phone in my hands. The rage was there, burning hot in my chest, but underneath it was something worse, the crushing weight of my own helplessness. I was a woman who solved problems for a living, who stayed calm in emergencies, who always had a plan. But my daughter was trapped on the other side of the world, and I had no idea how to reach her. I found myself thinking about my mother, who had died when Reina was 10. She'd been a teacher, a woman who believed that every problem had a solution if you were willing to work hard enough to find it. When I was struggling through nursing school as a young single mother, she used to call me every Sunday morning with the same reminder: "You're stronger than you think you are, Thessaly. You just have to remember how to use that strength." Sitting there in the darkness, I could almost hear her voice again. Not the comforting tone she used when I was scared, but the sharper edge she got when she was teaching me to stand up for myself. The voice that had walked me through my divorce proceedings, that had helped me navigate custody negotiations, that had reminded me over and over that being kind didn't mean being weak. I got up from the kitchen table and walked to my bedroom closet, pulling out a plastic storage box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were my old paralegal textbooks, case files from international custody disputes, and a notebook filled with contacts I'd made during those years when I specialized in cases exactly like this one. My hands were steady as I lifted out the first book, and for the first time since Reina's call, I felt something other than fear. I felt like myself again. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and turned my kitchen table into a command center. I spread out maps of Myanmar, printed immigration forms, and started making calls to every contact I could remember from my paralegal days. Most of the numbers were disconnected or had changed hands, but slowly, I began to build a network. The first breakthrough came from an old colleague named Patricia who now worked for the State Department. She couldn't help directly, she explained, but she could connect me with someone who specialized in emergency evacuations from Southeast Asia. The second came from a law professor I'd worked with on a custody case years earlier. He knew an immigration attorney who had contacts at the American Embassy in Yangon. But every step forward came with 3 steps back. The embassy was operating with minimal staff due to political instability. The immigration attorney wanted a $5,000 retainer just to start the paperwork. The emergency evacuation specialist explained that without proper documentation, my daughter was essentially a ghost in Myanmar's system, invisible to the people who could help her, but highly visible to the authorities who might detain her. 2 weeks into my research, I made my first major mistake. Desperate for faster results, I wired money to someone claiming to be a document specialist who promised to expedite Reina's emergency passport. 3 days later, I discovered the man didn't exist, and the money was gone. I sat on my bathroom floor that night, crying for the first time since this whole nightmare began, wondering if I was going to fail my daughter when she needed me most. But the next morning, I got back to work. Because giving up wasn't an option. The turning point came when I finally tracked down Marcus's family. It took 6 weeks of detective work, following paper trails and calling in favors, but I eventually discovered that Theta and Kyo hadn't just abandoned Reina, they had stolen her identity documents to facilitate their own illegal business dealings. They were using her American passport information to move money through international banking systems, essentially making her an unwitting accomplice to financial fraud. But they had made one crucial mistake. In their haste to cover their tracks, they had left a digital footprint that connected directly back to Marcus and Delphine's Cherry Hills village address. Bank transfers, email communications, even receipts for bribes paid to Myanmar officials, all of it traceable, all of it admissible in court. I spent 3 days building an airtight case, then made one phone call to the FBI's International Crimes Division. Within hours, federal agents were at Marcus's door with search warrants. Within days, Theta and Kyo were facing extradition requests from both American and Myanmar authorities. Within a week, every asset Marcus and Delphine owned was frozen pending investigation. The moment I knew I had won came when Marcus called me, his voice shaking with a desperation I'd never heard before. He was calling from a lawyer's office, he said, and he needed my help. The federal charges were serious: conspiracy to commit fraud, child endangerment, human trafficking. His family was looking at decades in prison unless they cooperated fully with authorities. He wanted to make a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for my agreement not to pursue additional civil charges. And the first step in that cooperation would be using their connections to get Reina home immediately, with full support from Myanmar officials who had been paid to look the other way. I listened to his entire pitch in silence, then gave him my answer. I would consider his proposal, I said, after my daughter was safely back on American soil. Not a moment before. Reina came home on a Thursday morning in September, stepping off a plane at Denver International Airport with a federal escort and a temporary passport that had cost Marcus's family more than $50,000 in bribes and legal fees. She was thinner than when she left, quieter, with shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. But she was alive, she was safe, and she was home. We didn't talk much during the drive back to our apartment. She stared out the window at the familiar Colorado landscape, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand as if she needed to confirm I was really there. It wasn't until we were sitting in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd received her desperate call months earlier, that she finally broke down and told me everything. The fear, the loneliness, the nights when she'd wondered if anyone was looking for her. The kindness of strangers who had helped her survive. The gradual realization that the people who were supposed to protect her had deliberately put her in danger. And underneath it all, the unshakable faith that somehow, someway, I would find a way to bring her home. 3 months later, Marcus was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Theta and Kyo were extradited to Myanmar, where they faced additional charges for their role in a broader corruption scheme. Delphine lost her house, her savings, and her social standing in a community that had once embraced her family's wealth and connections. But the victory felt different than I'd expected. Quieter. More like closure than revenge. Sometimes I sit in that same kitchen where this all began, drinking coffee in the early morning silence, and I think about the person I was before that phone call. The woman who trusted that other people would do the right thing, who believed that family meant protection, who thought that being prepared for emergencies meant keeping first aid supplies in every room. I'm not that person anymore. I'm someone who understands that the deepest betrayals come from the people closest to you, that love and blood don't guarantee loyalty, and that sometimes the only person you can truly count on is yourself. But I'm also someone who learned that buried skills never really disappear, that desperation can uncover strength you didn't know you had, and that a mother's love can move mountains, or at least move federal agents across international borders. Raina started college this fall, majoring in international law instead of pre-med. She says she wants to help other families who find themselves trapped by people they trusted. Sometimes I wonder if I changed her trajectory, if my fight for justice altered the path she would have chosen for herself. But then I remember that night when she was alone and afraid, calling me from halfway around the world, and I know that everything I did was worth it. The question I ask myself now isn't whether revenge was the right choice. It's whether standing up for the people you love, regardless of the cost, is always the right choice. And every morning when I wake up in the same apartment where my daughter is safe, where her acceptance letters still hang on the kitchen wall, I know the answer to that question. Some betrayals are unforgivable, but some loves are unstoppable.